just to give everyone a sense of our format for tonight, we will engage you, Isabel, with a few questions.
Mhm,
Then we'll have about a 15-minute Q&A with our audience.
mhm.
And for everyone in our audience, if you have a question for Isabel, please use the Q&A box and write in your questions there. And we will attempt to get to all the questions as much as possible. So, without further delay, let me ask the first question to Isabel. What was it like for you growing up in Cebu City? Actually, my grandmother is from Cebu City. And what was it like for you growing up in Cebu City in the Philippines? What are your fondest childhood memories? And how did you fall in love with film?
Yeah, so I was born and raised in Cebu. I had a wonderful childhood. I was raised by a single parent, by my mom. I, pretty much was an independent kid in that I did not, because I didn't grow up with siblings and with a large family, I kind of, you know, enjoyed my solitude and being creative very early on as a kid. I remember one of my earliest childhood memories was when my mom took me to Fulon Street, which is, in downtown Cebu. And it's actually the oldest street in the Philippines. It was named after Christopher Columbus.
Mm,
And at that time, this was in the late 80s, there were a lot of movie theaters that were built just after the Second World War that were still operating until then. And one of the earliest movies that I remember her taking me to was a movie starring Dolphy,
mm-hmm.
who is our like Filipino Charlie Chaplin for those who are not familiar. And I think I was like 4 at that time. I don't remember much about the movie itself, but I remember being in awe of these, you know, massive images being projected into this big screen. And I think it was that moment that I became fascinated with and enchanted with the moving image and movies that is. And you know, at that time, a lot of mainstream Filipino movies were very much genre oriented, like comedies starring Tito Vic and Joey,
Mm-hmm.
um, dramas that were based on serialized comics, movies starring Sharon Cuneta, like Between Walang Ningning, Vilma
Yes.
Santos, Ate Dai,
Darna, right?
yeah, Darna, and horror movies as well. But then, I went to school from kindergarten to college, essentially in Catholic schools, because a lot of private schools there were run by a religious order. And mine was run by Jesuits. I went to like Ateneo de Cebu essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And then for college, I went to the University of San Carlos, which was run
Yes.
by um, and a religious order as well. And I took up psychology. I did go to film school. I don't have a traditional film background. I studied psychology, and then after graduation, I moved to Manila. I
Mm-hmm.
worked for Unilever, which is the
Yes.
company that owns, Sunsilk, Cream Silk,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Lux, and while there, I became exposed to art house cinema or like world cinema because they were being sold as pirated DVDs in the black
Yes.
market stalls in Quiapo,
Or
and
Green
that's how
Hills,
I
right?
yeah that became my main kind of film school. Then
Mm-hmm.
that shaped my voice and sensibility as a filmmaker.
Perfect. Well, that's a nice segue into my next question to you, actually. Let's briefly cover Filipino films. So tell me about who are your favorite storytellers among Filipino filmmakers.
Mhm.
And you've made two movies before Lingua Franca, which
Yeah.
was, set here. And the first two were set in the Philippines. Um,
Mhm.
Give us an insight about what you think where the industry is headed in the homeland as well.
I'll start with who my favorite Filipino directors are.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, growing up in like the late 80s through the 90s, I would say that the most formative Filipino directors on me are one, Ishmael Bernal,
Mm-hmm.
and secondly, Nubroca. Ishmael Bernal, of course, the director of Himala, starring Nor Honor, and a lot of other classics like Manila After, Manila by Night or City After Dark. Also, um, Nunal sa Tubig. I liked, I'm a big fan of Ishmael Bernal because I think he has the most cosmopolitan perspective, I think, as a director. And he was really my first introductions like European art house movies with Lino Broca. He is, of course, the kind of major social realist director that we
Mm-hmm.
have. And
Right.
a lot of what we know to be international or art house Philippine cinema in the 70s and 80s are pretty much the works of Lino Broca. In Siang, uh, Manila and the Claws
Mm-hmm.
of Light, or Maynila sa
Kuko ng
Kuko
liwanag.
ng Liwanag.
Mm-hmm.
um,
Jaguar.
Jaguar, of course, Bona, or Upper Nobis. And so those are the two kind of main auteurs that shaped my own sensibility as a director. And the third one I'd have to see is Mike De Leon,
Right.
who was also very versatile. And I would consider Mike De Leon, not that they're, equivalent to each other, but he's kind of like the Steven Soderbergh of Philippine cinema in terms of just the range and the variety of genres and stories that he directed. He directed films like Itim,
Mm.
Isap Mata,
Yes.
Batch 81.
Right.
So he dabbled, no, not dabbled, but he was great at musicals. Like Kakabaka
Mm-hmm.
dramas, thrillers. And so those were the three influential Filipino directors for me as I was shaping my own aesthetic style and sensibility. And what was your second question?
The question is, where, you've made a couple movies in the Philippines. Where do you
Yeah,
think the industry is headed in the homeland?
it's quite fascinating. I feel like the mainstream Philippine film scene that we have now, or at least before Duterte shut them down, like ABS, CBN, or Star Cinema was pretty much really dominating, the industry. And it's a lot, it's very similar to Hollywood, I think, back in the 50s and 40s, the golden age of Hollywood, where most of the commercial film output are really, to a certain extent, monopolized by two or three studios who are the main players. And that was like the landscape, I think, in the Philippines up until a few years ago. Now, in terms of the independent film scene in the Philippines, it really blossomed in 2005 with the launch of Cinemalaya and also the digital filmmaking school. And of course, the foremost figure in this renaissance or this new wave of Philippine cinema are Brillante Mendoza, who won Best Director in Canada 2009, and Lab Diaz.
Mhm.
And Brillante especially you know, belongs in the tradition of a realist filmmaking paradigm, whereas with Broca, it was social realist. With Brillante Mendoza, who kind of, takes over or receives the torch from Lino Broca, it's more of a realist, kind of gritty, almost documentary-like realism, but again, still focusing on the experiences of those who belong to the lower and less privileged classes of society economically and politically. And it's interesting now because we are at a cultural moment when it comes to film that last year and this year, for instance, Asian filmmakers are really, you know, um, emerging and
Yeah.
establishing their talent and
Mhm.
presence in a
Right.
big way. I mean, last year, of course, Parasite was a
Mhm.
big winner at the Oscars, and this year we have the first ever Asian, female filmmaker to win Best Director at the Oscars, and for Nomadland to win
Right.
Best Picture as well. And they have all their distinct styles, but Bong Joon-ho,
Mhm.
Chloe Zhao
Mhm.
have their own very unique sensibilities as filmmakers. And I think it's really important, and key for Filipino filmmakers to also find our own distinct and signature style. And I'm not saying that there has to be just one style when it comes to Filipino directors.
Mhm.
I think that each Filipino filmmaker in a tour that wants to make waves, internationally, has to come up with something truly original um,
Mhm.
that differentiates us from the likes of Lino Broca and recently, of course, Pilante Mendoza and
Mhm.
Lab Diaz. And that's what I tried to do with my own work, with
Mhm.
Lingua Franca. When you read the synopsis of Lingua Franca on paper, it sounds like your typical social issue drama. Like it's a textbook. It touches on immigration. It touches on the trans experience in the U.S. But I use that as a jumping off point.
Mhm.
Because when you hear about a movie like that, you expect a certain kind of movie that's
Right.
very rah rah rah. I mean, almost didactic and preaching on the nose, but that's not the kind of filmmaker I am. And the more movies that I make, I feel like I'm becoming more subtle and
Mhm.
subdued
Mhm.
and quiet as a
Mhm.
filmmaker, in that I don't want to spoon feed the audience with
Right.
every detail or information or what the character is thinking or what they believe. I think, you know, an artist or a director that trusts the intelligence of an audience to meet them as storytellers and the work halfway, that's the kind of film that really makes the audience invest in, emotionally and intellectually. And I
Mhm.
think that's why Lingua Franca connected with audiences and resonated, you know, as deeply and as profoundly as it did, at least for the audiences that liked the film. And I noticed that my own style that makes me different, I think, from other contemporary Filipino and American directors is that, and it's very evident in Lingua Franca, is that I have my films deal with narratives or stories that have a strong political impulse or underpinning, but I
Mhm.
marry that with a style, or a tone that's more lyrical and poetic and
Right.
sensuous.
Right.
And that's why I think, I'm being considered an auteur, because really
Mhm.
being an auteur has to do with having a creative and artistic vision that's really singular and
Mhm.
distinct
Right.
from anyone else. And I think that's really the approach, because it's important to note that the Philippines has not been nominated for Best Foreign Language Film at
Right.
the Oscars.
Mhm.
And I'm not saying that the Oscars is the pinnacle of artistic merit when it
Recognition.
comes to
Yeah.
cinema, but it is considered an important achievement by a lot of you know people. And yes, it is, of course. But I think that's a reason why we haven't really made our mark at the Oscars is that for a long time now, we have been kind of really banking on the realistic style, the social realist style.
Mm-hmm.
That is pretty much, you know, done by a lot of third world cinema and filmmakers. So it's hard for us to really distinguish ourselves
Mm-hmm.
in that regard. And now it's incumbent upon us for the new generation of Filipino filmmakers to really be original and be bold.
Right. Well, I appreciate all of your insights. I grew up with those Filipino directors that you mentioned, and some of those movies are very familiar to me, having grown up in the Philippines in the 70s and 80s. So
Yeah.
I appreciate some of your references there. Now I'm talking about your immigration experience, right? So you moved from Manila, Philippines to the US. Share with us your immigration experience as you moved from Cebu City to New York City. What
Mhm.
were your dreams and expectations? What were your realizations?
Yeah, I moved to the US to New York from Manila to pursue a master's degree. So I came here to pursue an MBA at New York University, and then I applied for a scholarship. At the back of my mind, I was thinking I wanted to be in New York because New York is really the capital of the independent film scene
Mm-hmm.
in the US, and I just wanted to be, in the city where I could fall in love even more with movies.
Mm-hmm.
But it really took me a while and I had the dream of becoming a filmmaker, but it took me a while to convince myself that it could be a grown up / professional career. Because, a lot of us, like not just Filipino immigrants, but immigrants from different places come to the US, especially if you're the children of immigrants, you are conditioned to, or you are expected to pursue more traditional careers, medicine, law,
Right.
accounting, um, because there's a lot more financial security, in those careers. And that's what I was thinking initially. But then, when I graduated from business school and I worked for a digital marketing agency, at that point, I really can't deny that my passion is filmmaking and cinema.
Right.
So I decided to, well, first, after I graduated from business school, I had 1 year to get a job, through the OPT,
Right.
which is the optional practical training. Otherwise,
Right.
I'd have to
Go
go
back
back
to the
home.
Philippines. Yeah.
Exactly. And literally, I think a few weeks before that expired, I was able to apply for an O1 visa, which is the visa for aliens with extraordinary ability in the arts or sciences. And I got that because while I was in college, I was a copy editor of a nationally circulated lifestyle and culture magazine called Z. It's based in Cebu, but it was distributed nationally.
Okay.
And so I had a lot of, articles and pieces that were published. And so my immigration lawyer helped me apply for an O1 visa as a writer, essentially. And at that time, it was approved, rather easily.
Mm-hmm.
And so I also got a visa. The difference between O1 and H1 visa, which is the more traditional employment,
Professional
yeah,
employment visa. Yeah.
visa, is that it's not tied to a certain employer. So
Mm-hmm.
I could use my O1 visa and work for pretty much anyone. And that really helped me a lot. So I had that visa for, I think, 7 years until I applied for a green card.
Okay.
And pretty much while I was on my O1 visa, I decided to shoot my first films. So I made a short film called Senorita, and then I developed that into a full-length feature with the
Mm-hmm.
same name. And for that one, I actually flew back to Cebu, my
Okay.
hometown, to shoot that.
Right.
So even though I was already living in the US, the story that I came up with, happened to be set in the Philippines. So I flew back there. I have a good friend, Darlene Malimas, who's also a big, cinephile and a film buff. And she became the producer of Senorita and all my other features as well. And after I made Senorita and it premiered at a major international film festival in Europe called Locarno in Switzerland, less than a year later, I made Apparition, which is my follow-up. It's about nuns during the Marcos regime in 1971, and Apparition starred Jody Santa Maria.
Okay. I didn't know that you had some mainstream actors there.
Yeah. So it was, very well received in the Philippines, and it eventually got a theatrical release there. But piracy is so rampant in the Philippines that literally maybe 3 days after we opened in theaters, there were pirated DVDs of Operation.
Sure.
They were out in the streets, which is a big blow, to me as an independent filmmaker. And I just said to myself, I will never make an independent movie in the Philippines again. And, it's tough also because I don't think at that time there was barely any network of art, independent movie theaters and art house cinemas in the Philippines. Now there is, there are a few cinemas like that, but it's still, as an infrastructure relative to just the volume and the quantity of independent films being produced in the Philippines, there's just no distribution infrastructure to accommodate the release of the movies there that would, really allow for profit. There's no cultural mandate to when it comes to the distribution. There is for production because of all the grants that are given out. Like Apparition received quite a substantial amount of money from the CCP.
The cultural center of the
distribution is kind of like, you're on your own.
Right.
To a certain extent. And yeah, after I made Apparition, I transitioned. So that took a few years. And while I was transitioning, that was when I started writing the script for Lingua Franca. And that was my first film that was set finally in the US, where I've been living for years. And I set it in New York.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, because in the film, there's this constant drumbeat of Trump's, anti-immigration policies, right?
Yeah.
What was it like living through that period? And you said you were transitioning also during that period. And there was a lot of anti-transgender discriminatory laws being put out there. What was it like for you?
I'm lucky in that, I finished transitioning before Trump got elected.
Okay.
Although I was still working on the film then. And I got my green card a month before Trump's election.
Okay.
So that was quite a relief. I mean, although at that time, my green card application has been, in process well over 2 years. So I got it approved just in the nick of time. And, I think like a lot of minorities at that time, when it was inaugurated, like literally days after that, he announced his travel ban, prohibiting, nationals from 7 Middle Eastern countries to come back. And there was a big alarm because even those nationals that actually have US green cards were for a short time, denied entry back into the US. And, I feel like the night of the elections, it's like and I'm just speaking from my own experience, it was very surreal and, hard to believe. It was like being given a cancer diagnosis, and that, it really took me weeks and even months to grapple with the enormity and the gravity of that news. It's like going through the 7 stages, of grief. At first, there's denial, I think, the first few days. And I think for people, living in major progressive cities like New York City and Los Angeles and in Sacramento, there was that unreal, ghastly feeling that we're questioning, whether what just happened was real, because the entire time, Hillary was touted to be almost, a landslide winner in some sense. So, but then, through all that, there was still life that needed to be lived, and you have to just take it one day at a time. I'm lucky in that I happen to live in New York City, which is the, progressive and liberal stronghold in the US, just like Los Angeles,
San Francisco.
yeah, San Francisco, in that it wasn't as hard for me, and I already had my papers. So, but as much kind of anxiety and distress that I was going through, I could only imagine how much worse it was, for someone like Olivia in Lingua Franca, who's undocumented, and becomes an easy target for that reason. And I was essentially channeling my own mental and emotional state, and that I distilled that into what became the mood and tone of Lingua Franca, and that it's kind of a romantic drama, but it's also kind of anchored in a kind of tension and paranoia and dread throughout the film.
Right. So I just want to remind our audience that you can type in your questions in the Q&A box. So speaking about Lingua Franca now, and I think I've seen some of your interviews where you say that you were also transitioning as you were making the film or had finished transition. How has your family received the film? And what's been the reaction to Lingua Franca in the Philippines?
Yeah, so when I started transitioning, maybe like a few months after I started taking hormones, and I was noticing the physical changes in my body. This was in 2013, like late 2013. I decided to fly back to the Philippines to tell my mom in person. This was not something I could just like text her, call her about. So I flew back, and I said maybe 5 days to visit her. I flew her in from Cebu to Manila. So we were in Manila for 5 days. We were staying in a hotel, and literally the night before I was supposed to fly back, we went out, I took her to dinner. And then when we went back to the hotel, I was trying to muster the courage to tell her. And I was literally bawling my eyes out for over an hour. I was an incoherent mess before I even managed to blurt the words out that I'm transitioning, to becoming a woman. I'm undergoing this gender transition. And she was just, I guess, confused by how, kind of emotional I was becoming. And she said that, I don't fully understand yet, the implications of what you're going through. But at the end of the day, you're my child, and you're my only child. And I love you and I want you to be happy. I don't completely understand this now, but I want to support you. Of course, she wasn't jumping for joy. I mean, the Philippines is very Catholic, and my mom is quite religious. She's no exception in that regard. And I guess her biggest worry was, whether I was doing this gender transition in a safe way medically, that I was. And I assured her that, I was working every step of the way with a doctor to make sure that the entire process is safe. And it's not a decision that I arrived, very casually or overnight, it's a process that took me years. I didn't realize I was trans until I was in the US. And if I stayed in the Philippines, I don't think I would transition. In the US,
Why is that?
Just how close-minded people are. And growing up, when you talk about, trans women or how they're portrayed in films, I guess at that time, there wasn't even a proper notion or concept of being trans. It was just like Roderick Paulate,
Right.
that were very, effeminate and hyper feminized, but they were almost always the butt of jokes, in comic caricatures. And I would like to think of myself as an intelligent, articulate
Mm-hmm.
person. I just did not identify with that kind of depiction or portrayal. And so, but then when I moved to the US, and a few years after coming here, I came across on YouTube these different channels by people who were transitioning, and they were coming from different backgrounds and different walks of life. There were people who were copywriters, working in marketing. Some people were married with children. Some people were working for nonprofits, and they were essentially chronicling the changes that they were experiencing while on hormones. Like, so this is like 6 weeks now, and these are the changes and psychological changes that I'm noticing.
Mm-hmm.
2 months, 3 months, and I just it made it easier for me, I think, to realize that the questions these people were asking themselves, when it comes to their gender identity, were the same as the questions I was asking myself.
Yeah.
Before I transitioned, I never wore, women's clothes. It was not about that for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized I made a decision to transition when I had an epiphany that I wasn't transitioning to become a woman, but I'm transitioning to become more fully myself,
Mm-hmm.
and that just happened to be a woman. And I also realized that there are different ways to express, one's femininity. And I don't have to be like a Kardashian wannabe, or a beauty pageant type in order to do that. I can just be myself, but, look like a woman. So
Mm-hmm.
this is essentially the same personality I had before I
Okay.
transitioned.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that story with us. So, I also wanted to you referenced Roderick Paulate and some of the um, kind of like portrayals of transgender women in the Philippines in films, right? And so, what has been the reaction to lingua franca in the Philippines? It's very different, right, from that
Yeah.
traditional way of stereotyping transgender women in the Philippines.
Yeah. I mean, one of our top celebrities is Vice Ganda.
Mm-hmm.
Although I don't think, is it she or she is technically a trans woman. I think,
Right.
you know, again, there's the expectation that when you're presenting as feminine or, effeminate,
Mm-hmm.
or, that's sometimes getting lumped in with being trans. And that persona of being this very gregarious, you know, um, loud and boisterous and very, very funny is in in sharp contrast to Olivia in Lingua
Right.
Franca.
Mm-hmm.
That's very kind of more down to earth and naturalistic, resilient. So, I wasn't surprised that the response would be more muted.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's also because, yeah, this was my first movie after my transition. And people didn't really know who I am, who I
Right.
was.
Mm-hmm.
And so I expected that. But when the movie got shown at more and more international festivals and started winning, recognition and acclaim and awards, especially after Ava DuVernay and
Yeah.
her film distribution collective Array
Mm-hmm.
acquired it for North America, and it premiered on Netflix, and got some really positive notices and media coverage. That's what I think the public opinion on the film
Mm-hmm.
turned around quite considerably in the Philippines.
Yeah. That's great. So we're gonna show here a clip from the movie. It's a short clip, and I'm gonna ask you a question after we watch this clip.
Yeah.
Okay, bam. Um, Question for you, Isabel. How hard is it to find love?
Um, Not hard. Um, not to get too personal, but I'm in a healthy and nurturing romantic relationship, and
Yeah.
I'm very fortunate, in that regard. And there are also a lot of, trans women, Filipino trans women in the U.S. who are in healthy romantic relationships. Yeah.
So just to set the stage a
I
little bit, because we didn't really set the stage for that clip, the the gentleman that you see in the movie is Alex. The name of the character is Alex, and he portrays your love interest in the movie,
yeah,
right? And he is the son of the elderly woman that you're serving as a caregiver, caretaker.
yeah.
And in that movie, and we're going to go into the audience questions. There actually is a particular question around that relationship. So
Okay.
yeah. Okay, well, I appreciate your candor in answering that question. Short but sweet. I like that. Okay, so before we go to the audience questions, I just want to ask one more, and then we'll segue into the audience questions. So many of our kababayan, mostly women, work in the caregiving sector, and many, as you probably know, are exploited due to their tenuous immigration status. Similar to your character in Lingua Franca, many send money back home and they send balikbayan boxes. What made you decide to set the film in this caregiving sector? And why was this important for you?
It's important for me because, like you said, a lot of Filipinos here in the US work in some kind of caregiving capacity, whether it's as nurses, as healthcare workers, or as caregivers. I think that's become kind of our brand um, as immigrants here in the US, like the first generation, Filipinos that come here at least. And but it's we're that being said, we continue to be like invisible and voiceless in
Mhm.
that regard, and that we're always in the background or in the periphery. And I thought Lingua Franca, by having uh, a main character that was essentially a Filipina caregiver, and have the story be about her and her situation and her experiences in a film that's ostensibly American, surrounded by American characters and actors, I think it's very important to kind of give a depth and complexity to the
Mhm.
nameless faces that we see, around us. And yeah, I've always said that my films, especially Lingua Franca, I don't try to make it overtly or explicitly political, but given the subject matter,
Yeah.
and given who I am, it's in by choosing the subject matter that I make a movie about and choosing the main character.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, the least that I could do is to depict this experience and this kind of point of view with sensitivity and intimacy and
Mhm.
honesty. And I like to think that the Filipino community who have seen it and who like the film thinks that I did justice, to the story. And I hope that the success of Lingua Franca would encourage more Filipino filmmakers to tell our stories our own way. It was
Right.
important for me to open and close this film that's set in America with voiceover in Cebuano.
Mhm.
And, when you see essentially images set in Coney Island, which is the most quintessentially American,
Mhm.
scenery, to
Mhm.
hear the voiceover in Cebuano, they know that this is not just going to be any other American film, and that this is a story that's going to be told from a certain Filipino vernacular and perspective, and mine that's Cebuano.
Right. I have to tell you, I also appreciated that it's in multiple Filipino
Yeah,
languages, right? In Tagalog or Filipino and also
yeah,
Cebuano. Not that because I understand both, right? Having a grandmother from Cebu helped me to understand that,
yeah,
the Cebuano parts. But it was also affirming as a Filipino American in the US to hear
yeah.
your language spoken
Mhm.
on film, on Netflix, right? So I have here one question before we kind of like go into a more detail into your relationship with Alex in the film.
Mhm.
There's a question here. How did you handle all of the roles in making Lingua Franca? Being a writer, director at the same time, editor, that's a lot of roles to handle and juggle. Tell us about that.
For me, it's because I didn't think I had multiple roles or jobs. I had one role, and that's as the filmmaker, as the auteur. And that happened to have multiple facets to it. I don't consider myself like a control freak in any
Mhm.
way that I had to like take charge over all aspects of production. But the ones that I did, writing, directing, playing the main character, and editing the film, those are the critical roles that I need to take on to make sure that my vision for the film, which is very clear in my head, that I'm
Mhm.
able to translate it from the page of the screenplay to the screen as
Mhm.
faithfully as possible.
Right.
Yeah, it definitely helped that I knew the kind of movie that I wanted to make,
Yeah.
and that made it easy for me. Um,
Right. I also read somewhere that you, as producer,
mhm.
initially folks were saying this is a film worth this much money, or to produce it, it's gonna take 1.5 million, and then you
Yeah,
made a choice to make the movie at $500,000. Is that right? And
yeah.
what were the choices behind that for you?
That was initially where I wanted to keep it at because we had a producer that wanted to bring it up to like 1 million to 1.5, and like, listen, this is a movie about a documented Filipina trans woman. That's as niche as you can get.
Right.
You don't need 1.5 million to make this movie. It's just like setting up, a higher hurdle for us to break even, financially, for
Mhm.
the movie. And I want audiences. I want it to be a true achievement in producing, and that we're able to make a film that looks great and that is great, at a certain budget level.
Right.
And that's why it was a very, very vindicating for me when the film was nominated for the John Cassavetes Award at the
Mhm.
2021 Independent Spirit Awards, because that award is for best feature produced under $500,000.
Well, it has won several awards, right? It
Yes.
won Best Narrative at Bentonville. You
Yeah.
also won a Best Actress trophy, right?
That,
What does that mean for you, as a trans Filipina woman of color, to receive such accolades and prizes?
um, I think it's, you know, truly wonderful. I hope that it emboldens and inspires other artists, or Filipina or immigrants or trans to really, go out there. If you have a project or a role that you're truly passionate about and that you feel in your bones, that you can give
Mhm.
justice to, then you should totally pursue it. I did. And I think it's just that belief in myself and that confidence in my own voice that really shone through in the filmmaking and the performance. And I'm ecstatic that it's being recognized.
Yeah. Well, I'm so happy for you. I have a question here from the audience about the meaning behind lingua franca. What was the connection of that title to the movie?
Yeah, lingua franca, the dictionary definition of that is bridge language, essentially. So it's a language that's spoken by, two people whose native languages are different, So in the case of Alex, like for a Russian Jewish man and a Filipina woman, they can't communicate with each other through their native languages. So they have to speak English. And that's what lingua franca is. And in the film, though, I mean it ironically because it's not necessarily, of course, they communicate to each other in English, But what's most important between them is actually what's left unsaid
Mhm.
and unarticulated.
Mhm.
And it's also, you know, reflective of my evolving style as a filmmaker, in that I feel like besides the dialogue and the words that are spoken, there's more truth and honesty in the silences and the pauses and the gaps in between. And I'm inviting the audience to lean closer and pay attention
Mhm.
to the gaps between the words.
Perfectly said. So this question, next one, is kind of related to the clip that we showed, right?
Yeah.
And it might be a film spoiler, but
Mhm.
tell us as much as you can. So people are curious about your
Yeah.
choice in the final, moments in the film.
Mhm.
To the extent that you can answer that question, how would you respond?
What's the final question?
Oh, the question is, um, why, what made, well, you made a choice at the end of the movie.
Should I just tell it?
I don't know. I don't know. How do you feel about it? Well, tell us how you kind of like, what's the choice and why did you make that choice as the character, as
Yeah.
Olga, right? I'm sorry, as Olivia.
So, okay, you know, spoiler alert,
Yes.
Olivia turns down the offer from Alex to marry her for the green card.
Hmm.
And this was because essentially, you know, at the moment that he offers her marriage, she realizes that he essentially gaslit her, you know, and made up this story about ICE going after her and hunting her down. That really plunged her in a kind of emotional crisis, you know, like really feeling scared and paranoid. Because sure, I mean, would she marry a man? It's like her thinking is that am I going to marry a man who essentially exploited my deepest fears, you know,
Right.
and anxieties, or you know, and get out of this situation of this not having papers. But she turns him down, and that means, at least for me, you know, it means that she really does love him that much for his betrayal to wound her that deeply and
Hmm.
that intensely.
Hmm.
And you know, I also, you know, in the shoes of Olivia, like this is a man who's essentially a child, you know, and his family is very conservative,
Hmm.
and he grew up in an environment that, you know, Russians are not the most queer friendly people.
Hmm.
And so she was just being practical and
Hmm.
pragmatic, you know, and resilient.
Hmm.
Um, and ultimately, she wanted to be able to gain her agency back to decide for herself
Hmm.
what she wants. And I think because she made that decision, because I chose to end the movie that way, it ultimately becomes truly unconventional, you know, and
Right.
not cliche,
Hmm.
because everyone expects a happy ending. But that that kind of decision forces the audience to look at Olivia more than just a trans woman looking for love or an immigrant working for papers. She's far more complex and layered, you know,
Right.
um, and deeper as a person that than those intersectional labels, you know,
Mhm.
would make you think she is.
Right.
And it's because ultimately I'm compelling the audience to really think through why did she decided that way. That made Lingua Franca a truly powerful film that doesn't provide easy answers to complex social, political, and personal questions.
Thank you. So I hope that's satisfying to people who ask
Yeah.
that question here. I have another question here about sensuality as a kind of tone in your filmmaking, and you can feel that in the movie. This is someone who's seen it. How do you create that tone in your work, and how do you feel it helps you tell your story?
I one another formative international director to me was Wong Kar-wai.
Mhm.
Um, you know, Chungking Express, Happy Together, and most especially In the Mood for Love.
Mhm.
And I think just while making Lingua Franca, after having made two films that were more political and darker and just more grim, I'm starting, and also after having transitioned, I'm just becoming more open to sensuality and the images in my film,
Yeah.
you know? And because we want to experience art that gives us a truly unique emotional experience and sensuality, especially when it comes to portraying the sensuality of a woman, a minority at that, like a Filipina trans woman, is just so rare, in American cinema. And I knew that that was an emotional experience that would be very, very unique and distinct and singular and in a way truly radical and groundbreaking in American cinema.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you for that answer. So we have one question before we close out. I've learned that you're developing a drama for FX called Vespertine and a film, Tropical Gothic, about the haunting of a Spanish conquistador in the 16th century
Yeah.
Philippines. I'd love to see both. So the question here that I and other people are asking is, what's next for you? These are currently in production or pre-production, and you're working with Ava DuVernay's company Array. What's next for Isabel Sandoval?
Um, a few months ago, I was very, very, honored and thrilled to be represented by CAA as a client. And actually, my agent, Rina Arguelles, is Filipino as well. She represents Ava and Taika Waititi and Patty Jenkins, who directed Wonder Woman.
Mhm.
And I have my managers as well, and they've just been tremendous partners and mentors in guiding me through my career in Hollywood. I, as you mentioned, I'm working in Tropical Gothic. That's something I'm very, very passionate and excited about. It's my fourth feature and my most ambitious one. Uh, all my three features up until Lingua Franca are kind of steeped in that social realist orientation that I mentioned before. But with Tropical Gothic, I think, I push the sensuality and lyricism, the poetry of lingua franca even further. And it's also an allegory on colonialism. Yeah, I feel like it's interesting because, you know, I've been living by this time, I've lived in the US for 16 years, and now I'm going back to the Philippines again
Yeah.
to make another movie. And as they say, you can't really you know, take out, you might be able to take the Philippines out of, the Filipino out of the Philippines, but you can never take the Philippines,
So
out of the
true.
Filipino. And yeah, as ambivalent and complicated my relationship with the Philippines is, I can't deny that I'm Filipino and it's part of my DNA, part of my history, and part of who I am.
Well, with those words, thank you so much, Isabel, for joining us in this conversation. Loved it, and I hope our audience members appreciated hearing from you. You're such an inspiration, and I tell more people about the film, and really looking forward to your future work. Thank you for our audience for joining us, and check out our upcoming talk on May 20th with Grace Talusan about her book, The Body Papers, and don't forget to give to big day of giving if you are able to. So Isabel, I hope this is not the last time we can connect with you and hear from you, and
Likewise.
we'd love to have you again, perhaps talk about that Spanish conquistador story. Is Sounds fascinating. I'd love to hear more about that in the future.
Wonderful.
So
I love.
Yeah, so Isabel, thank you again. I don't want to keep you from your dinner. And everyone else, thank you for joining us. Magandang gabi, magandang salamat, and we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye,
Salamat.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye, Isabel. Thank you.
Thanks.